I'm sitting in lawyer Thomas Whitman's office on a gray Tuesday morning in March, staring at a wooden box that's about to destroy everything I thought I knew about my life. My hands are shaking so badly I have to clasp them together in my lap to stop the trembling. The mahogany surface is smooth, unmarked, and innocent-looking. Nothing that would suggest it contains 37 years of lies. My husband Richard looked me in the eyes 3 weeks before he died and swore he had no secrets from me. I begin, my voice already cracking with the weight of what I'm about to tell you. 37 years of marriage, 2 beautiful children, a house in suburban Chicago where we plan to grow old together. I believed every single word that man ever said to me. Thomas clears his throat and slides the box closer to me across his polished desk. Mrs. Carter, as I mentioned on the phone, Richard left very specific instructions about this. Only you can open it, and only after his other affairs were properly settled. The fluorescent lights above us hum, and I can hear the traffic from Michigan Avenue through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Everything feels surreal, like I'm watching someone else's life unfold. Just 4 weeks ago, I was Elena Carter, devoted, wife and mother, planning Richard's funeral arrangements and accepting casseroles from neighbors. Now I'm sitting here about to discover that the man I shared a bed with for nearly 4 decades was a complete stranger. What exactly did he tell you about this box? I asked Thomas, though part of me doesn't want to know the answer. Thomas adjusts his glasses and looks down at his legal pad. He came to see me about 6 months ago. Mrs. Carter, he said, he needed to prepare something in case anything happened to him. He was very insistent that this particular item not be included with his regular will and testament 6 months ago. That was right around the time Richard started taking those mysterious phone calls, the ones that ended abruptly whenever I walked into the room. The same time he began working late more often, claiming his insurance company was going through major changes. I think back to that final conversation we had in the hospital just hours before his heart gave out completely. Richard was lying there, pale as the white sheets, connected to machines that beeped steadily in the background. I was holding his hand, stroking his fingers the way I'd done for thousands of nights before. "Elena," he had whispered, his voice barely audible above the medical equipment. "I need you to know that I love you more than life itself. I love you too, sweetheart," I had replied, leaning closer to hear him better. "You're going to be fine. We're going to get through this together." But then he said something that didn't make sense at the time. His eyes filled with tears, and he squeezed my hand with what little strength he had left. "I'm sorry, Elena. I'm so sorry for everything. Please forgive me." I thought he was talking about leaving me alone, about the heart attack, about our retirement plans that would never happen. I kissed his forehead and whispered, "There's nothing to forgive, Richard. You've been the perfect husband." Now, staring at this box that Thomas Whitman placed in front of me with the gravity of someone handling evidence in a murder trial, I realized Richard wasn't asking forgiveness for dying. He was asking forgiveness for how he had lived. Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. "Are you ready, Mrs. Carter?" Thomas asks gently. I take a deep breath and reach for the box, having no idea that opening it will reveal that I never knew my husband at all. Before I tell you what was inside that box, you need to understand what my life looked like before everything shattered. You need to know what I thought I had so you can understand what I lost. Richard and I lived in a beautiful 2-story colonial house on Maple Street in Naperville, just outside Chicago. White picket fence, red brick facade, and a front porch where we'd sit together every summer evening watching our neighbors walk their dogs. Richard was a senior executive at Midwest Mutual. Insurance, the kind of man who wore pressed suits every day and never forgot to bring me flowers on Fridays. Every morning for 37 years, Richard would kiss my forehead before leaving for work and say the same thing. "You're my entire world, Elena. Don't you ever forget that." I can still feel the warmth of his lips on my skin. Still smell his cologne. That woody scent that lingered on his pillow long after he left for the office. I was the perfect wife, or at least I tried to be. I kept our house spotless, cooked Richard's favorite meals, managed our social calendar, and made sure our children, Marcus and Sarah, never wanted for anything. Every Sunday, our dining room would fill with the sounds of family. Marcus talking about his work in marketing, Sarah sharing stories about her teaching career, Richard carving the roast while making jokes that had us all laughing until our sides hurt. Our refrigerator was covered with vacation photos spanning decades. There we were in Yellowstone in 1995, Richard's arm around my waist as we posed in front of Old Faithful. Christmas morning 2003, with Marcus and Sarah tearing open presents while Richard and I sat on the couch in matching holiday sweaters, looking ridiculously happy. Our 10th anniversary trip to Napa Valley, where Richard surprised me with a private wine tasting and told me he'd marry me all over again in a heartbeat. We had plans, I tell people when they ask how I'm coping. Big plans. Richard and I were going to retire together in 2 years. We'd already picked out a small villa in Tuscany that we'd rent for 3 months every year. He'd learned to paint watercolors. I'd finally write that novel I'd been talking about since college. We'd grow tomatoes in clay pots and drink wine every afternoon while watching the sunset over the Italian countryside. The bedroom walls in our house were painted sunshine yellow because Richard said it reminded him of my smile. I want to wake up every morning surrounded by Elena's happiness, he told the painter, making me blush like a teenager. That room was our sanctuary, filled with photos of our life together, books we'd read aloud to each other, and a hope chest at the foot of the bed where I kept love letters he'd written me during his business trips. Our evening routine was sacred and never varied. Every night at exactly 8 sows, I'd brew chamomile tea while Richard settled into his leather recliner with the latest issue of Insurance Weekly or Financial Times. I'd curl up on the sofa nearby, organizing family photos or working on scrapbook pages, and we'd talk about our days. He'd tell me about difficult clients or office politics. I'd share gossip from my book club or updates about the kids. "How was your day, beautiful?" he'd ask, reaching over to squeeze my hand. "Better now that you're home," I'd always reply. And I meant it every single time. Looking back now, I realize those moments felt so genuine, so real that it never occurred to me they might be performed. Richard was such a good actor that even I, the woman who knew him better than anyone, never suspected I was watching a show. The first crack in my perfect marriage appeared on a humid Thursday evening in September, about 6 months before Richard's heart attack. I remember the date exactly because it was the night everything started feeling different, though I didn't understand why at the time. I was in our kitchen preparing Richard's favorite dinner, grilled salmon with lemon butter and roasted asparagus, when I heard his voice drifting from his home office down the hall. He was speaking in hushed tones, which was unusual because Richard typically conducted all his business calls in his normal, confident voice that could carry through our entire house. "No, she doesn't know anything about this, and it needs to stay that way," I heard him say clearly through the partially open door. My hand stopped mid-motion as I was seasoning the fish. Something in his tone made my stomach flutter with unease. Richard's voice sounded tense, almost anxious, which was completely unlike him. In 36 years of marriage, I'd rarely heard Richard sound worried about anything. I set down the spice shaker and walked quietly toward his office, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floors. Through the crack in the door, I could see Richard hunched over his desk, phone pressed tightly to his ear, his free hand running through his silver hair, something he only did when he was deeply stressed. "I told you this has to remain completely confidential," he continued, his voice dropping even lower. "If this gets out, it ruins everything we've worked for." The conversation ended abruptly, and I heard the sharp click of his phone being placed back in its cradle. I quickly retreated to the kitchen, my heart pounding for reasons I couldn't quite explain. When Richard emerged from his office 5 minutes later, he looked perfectly composed again, straightening his tie and smiling at me like nothing had happened. "Something smells incredible in here," he said, wrapping his arms around my waist from behind and kissing my neck the way he'd done thousands of times before. "Who are you talking to, honey?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual as I leaned back against his chest. Richard's body tensed almost imperceptibly, but I felt it. "Just work stuff, Elena. Don't worry your pretty little head about it," he replied. But when I turned around to face him, his eyes wouldn't quite meet mine. Instead, he busied himself washing his hands at the sink. It sounded serious, I pressed gently. "Is everything okay at the office?" "Everything's fine, sweetheart. You know how these corporate restructuring meetings go. Lots of confidential discussions about personnel changes and budget allocations, nothing that would interest you." His explanation felt rehearsed, like he'd prepared it while walking from his office to the kitchen. Richard had never spoken to me that way before, with that patronizing tone that suggested I wouldn't understand his important business matters. 2 weeks later, I was doing laundry when I found Richard's phone in his pants pocket. As I pulled it out to set it aside, it buzzed with an incoming call. The screen showed a name I'd never seen before, V. Morrison. "Richard," I called out, walking toward the living room where he was watching the evening news. "Your phone is ringing. Someone named V. Morrison." The color drained from Richard's face so quickly I thought he might be having a medical episode. He practically lunged for the phone, snatching it from my hands. "I'll take this in my office," he said curtly, already walking away. "It's about Marcus's birthday surprise." But Marcus's birthday had been 2 months earlier, and I'd organized that entire party myself. After the mysterious phone call started, Richard began working late more frequently. What used to be occasional overtime became a regular pattern that slowly ate away at the foundation of our daily life together. "Sorry, Elena." Another late client meeting tonight became Richard's standard text message, usually arriving around 4 p.m. when I was starting dinner preparations. "Don't wait up for me." I would stand in our kitchen at 6:30 p.m., looking at the carefully prepared meals growing cold on the counter. Richard's favorite pot roast with carrots and potatoes, the homemade apple pie I'd spent the afternoon baking, 2 place settings at our dining room table that seemed to mock me with their optimism. By 7 p.m., I'd cover his plate with aluminum foil and put it in the refrigerator. By 8 p.m., I'd eat my portion alone, the sound of my fork against the china echoing in the silence. Our sacred evening routine disappeared entirely. The chamomile tea ritual we'd shared for decades became a solitary affair. I'd brew 1 cup instead of 2, sitting on our sofa with photo albums spread around me. But the joy had gone out of organizing our memories. Instead of Richard's gentle commentary about the pictures, "Remember how sunburned you got that day in Florida?" Or, "Look how young Marcus looks in his Little League uniform," there was only the ticking of our grandfather clock and the distant hum of late-night traffic. Richard would finally come home around 10 or 11 p.m., looking genuinely exhausted. His shoulders would be slumped, his usually perfect hair disheveled, his tie loosened around his neck like he'd been wrestling with difficult problems all day. "How was your day, sweetheart?" I'd ask from the sofa, trying to keep the loneliness out of my voice. "Long," he'd reply with a heavy sigh, heading straight for the stairs. "The insurance industry is going through major changes, Elena. Lots of restructuring, new federal regulations, client retention issues. I'm sorry I'm not better company these days." His explanations always sounded plausible, even caring. He'd pause at the bottom of the stairs and look back at me with what seemed like genuine regret. "I know this is hard on you. Once things settle, down at work, we'll get back to our normal routine." But things never settled down. If anything, they got worse. Our Sunday family dinners, the cornerstone of our family tradition for over 3 decades, became casualties of Richard's increasingly demanding schedule. "Mom, where's Dad?" Sarah would ask, looking around our dining room that felt too large with only 3 of us seated at the table. "Another urgent client call," I'd explain, serving the roast that Richard used to carve with such ceremony. You know how important his work is. But even as I defended him, doubt gnawed at me. What client needed to discuss insurance policies at 2 p.m. on a Sunday afternoon? What corporate restructuring required meetings on Christmas Eve? What federal regulations demanded Richard's attention during Marcus's birthday dinner? The worst part wasn't Richard's absence. It was his presence. When he was home, he felt miles away. During the rare evenings when he joined me in the living room, he'd sit in his leather recliner, scrolling through his phone instead of reading his magazines. When I tried to start conversations, his responses became monosyllabic. "How was your book club today?" he'd ask, but his eyes remained fixed on his phone screen. "We discussed The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo," I'd begin enthusiastically. "It's about this reclusive Hollywood star who finally decides to tell her life story." And he'd interrupt, thumb still swiping across his screen. "That's nice, Selena." I started talking to the silence, sharing stories about my day with empty rooms, asking questions that no one was there to answer. The moment that shattered my remaining illusions happened at Bob and Margaret Thompson's 30th wedding anniversary party on a crisp Saturday evening in November. The Thompsons lived just 3 blocks from us, and we'd been celebrating life's milestones together for over 20 years. Margaret had gone all out. Their backyard was strung with white lights, round tables covered in gold linens dotted their patio, and a jazz quartet played softly near their rose garden. Richard and I arrived together, but within minutes of walking through their back gate, he was pulled into a conversation with several colleagues from Midwest Mutual. I should have been used to this by then. Richard was always the center of attention. At social gatherings, the kind of man other men wanted to talk business with and women found charming. I mingled on my own, chatting with Margaret about her catering choices and complimenting the Hendersons on their recent cruise to Alaska. About an hour into the party, I was standing near the dessert table, sampling Margaret's famous chocolate mousse, when I decided to check on Richard. I spotted him across the patio, standing in a tight circle with 3 other men, all of them holding glasses of Bob's expensive scotch. As I approached their group carrying 2 cups of coffee I'd thought to bring Richard, I heard his voice clearly, above the jazz music and party chatter. "Marriage is just a business partnership after a while, gentlemen," Richard was saying with a laugh that didn't sound like his usual warm chuckle. "You find your happiness wherever you can get it, if you know what I mean." The other men, James Morrison from Richard's office, Dr. Peterson from down the street, and someone I didn't recognize, all nodded knowingly, their expressions shifting, between amusement and what looked like envy. "Some of us are luckier than others in that department," James replied with a smirk, raising his glass in what seemed like a toast to Richard's statement. My feet felt rooted to the patio stones. The coffee cups in my hand suddenly weighed 1,000 pounds. These men were talking about their marriages, our marriages, like they were discussing stock portfolios or golf handicaps. "Richard," I said quietly, stepping into their circle. All 4 men turned toward me with expressions that ranged from embarrassment to annoyance, as if I'd interrupted an important business meeting. James quickly excused himself, muttering something about needing to find his wife, and walked away so fast he nearly knocked over a chair. Dr. Peterson suddenly became fascinated by something happening near the band, leaving Richard and the stranger standing with me in an awkward triangle. "Elena, sweetheart," Richard said, his voice taking on that artificially bright tone he used when he was performing for others. "I was just discussing some workplace philosophy with the guys." "What were you talking about?" I asked, though I'd heard every word perfectly clearly. Richard's face flushed slightly, and he took a long sip of his scotch before responding. "Nothing that would interest you, Elena. Just guy talk about career pressures and work-life balance." He turned slightly toward the stranger, effectively cutting me out of the conversation. "Why don't you go talk to the other wives about no recipes or book clubs or whatever you ladies discuss?" The dismissal hit me like a physical blow. After 36 years of marriage, I had become one of the wives to my own husband, not his partner, not his confidant, not even Elena, just another middle-aged woman he had to tolerate at social functions. "Of course," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'll just go find Margaret." I walked away on unsteady legs, leaving the coffee cups on the nearest table because I couldn't trust my hands not to shake. Richard's heart attack came without warning on a Tuesday morning in February. 3 months after the anniversary party that changed everything between us, I was in our kitchen making breakfast. Scrambled eggs and wheat toast, the same meal I'd prepared for him nearly every morning for 37 years, when I heard a horrible crash from the dining room. The sound was wrong, too loud and too sudden for our quiet morning routine. I dropped the spatula and ran toward the noise, my slippers sliding on the hardwood floor. What I found will haunt me for the rest of my life. Richard was lying crumpled, on the floor next to our dining table. His coffee mug shattered beside him, dark liquid spreading across the cherrywood planks we'd refinished together just 2 summers ago. His face was gray, his lips already turning blue, and his eyes were wide with terror and pain. "Richard!" I screamed, dropping to my knees beside him, my nightgown soaking up the spilled coffee. "Stay with me, sweetheart. Stay with me." My hands were shaking so violently I could barely dial 911. But somehow muscle memory took over. I started CPR, the way I'd learned in that community safety class we'd taken together 5 years earlier, pumping his chest with all my strength while tears streamed down my face. "Come on, Richard," I whispered between compressions. "Don't you dare leave me. We have Italy to see, remember? We have grandchildren to spoil someday. Don't you dare give up on us." The paramedics arrived in what felt like hours, but was probably only 8 minutes. They took over with professional efficiency, loading Richard onto a stretcher while I stood there in my coffee-stained nightgown, watching my husband's life hang in the balance. At Chicago Memorial Hospital, I paced the cardiac unit waiting room for 6 hours while doctors worked to save Richard's life. Marcus and Sarah rushed in from their respective suburbs, both of them looking as terrified as I felt. We held each other and waited, drinking terrible vending machine coffee and pretending to read magazines. None of us could focus. When Dr. Rodriguez finally emerged from the cardiac care unit, his expression told me everything before he spoke a single word. "We've stabilized him for now," he said gently. "But the damage to his heart is extensive. The next few hours are critical." I was allowed to sit beside Richard's hospital bed that evening, holding his hand while machines beeped steadily around us, monitoring every function of his failing body. He looked so small, connected to all those tubes and wires, nothing like the confident man who dismissed me as one of the wives just 3 months earlier. Around 9 p.m., Richard's eyes fluttered open. He looked confused at first, then his gaze found mine, and something like relief crossed his features. "Helena," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the medical equipment. "I'm right here." "Sweetheart," I said, squeezing his fingers gently. "I'm not going anywhere." He tried to sit up slightly, wincing with the effort. "Elena, I need you to know something. I need you to know that despite everything, despite all my mistakes, I love you more than life itself." "I love you too," I replied, leaning closer to hear him better. "Save your strength. You're going to be fine. We're going to get through this together, like we always do." But Richard shook his head weakly, tears forming in his eyes. "No, you don't understand. I'm sorry, Elena. I'm so sorry for everything. Please, please forgive me for the man I became." Those were the last coherent words my husband ever spoke to me. 3 hours later, his heart gave out completely, and I became a widow at 62. The 3 weeks after Richard's funeral were the darkest of my entire life. I'm not talking about normal grief. I'm talking about a complete disconnection from reality, from myself, from any sense that life had meaning or purpose. Our house on Maple Street became a mausoleum. Every room held memories that felt like physical attacks, The dining room, where Richard collapsed, still smelled faintly of that morning's coffee, despite my scrubbing the hardwood floors on my hands and knees until my skin was raw. I couldn't bring myself to sit at our kitchen table where we'd shared thousands of meals, so I ate standing at the counter when I remembered to eat at all. The sympathy cards covered every surface, our coffee table, the mantelpiece, even stacked in boxes on the floor because there were too many to display. Casserole dishes from neighbors filled our refrigerator. Tuna noodle casserole from the Hendersons, lasagna from Margaret Thompson, chicken and rice from people I barely knew, but who felt compelled to feed the grieving widow. I couldn't sleep. In our bedroom. Those sunshine yellow walls that Richard said reminded him of my smile now felt like they were mocking me. The bed we'd shared for 37 years stretched like an ocean of emptiness, his pillow still holding the faint scent of his cologne. I tried lying there the first night after the funeral, but the silence was deafening. Every creak of the house settling, every distant car passing on our street, every tick of our grandfather clock felt amplified in the darkness. So I moved to the living room couch, wrapping myself in the afghan my mother had crocheted years ago, surrounded by photo albums I couldn't bear to look at but couldn't put away. Our entire life was spread across those coffee tables. Richard's proud smile at Marcus's college graduation, our silver anniversary dinner at Giovanni's downtown Christmas, mornings with wrapping paper scattered around our feet like confetti. Marcus and Sarah had stayed for the funeral and a few days after, but they had their own lives to return to. Marcus needed to get back to his marketing firm in Schaumburg. Sarah had a classroom of third graders waiting for her in Oak Park. They left with promises to call every day and visit on weekends. But suddenly, I was alone in a way I'd never experienced. The phone rang constantly during those first weeks, friends from church, neighbors checking on me, Richard's colleagues from Midwest Mutual expressing their condolences. But I stopped answering after the 5th day. What was I supposed to say? That I felt like I was disappearing? That I sat on my couch for hours without moving, sometimes forgetting to turn on lights as evening fell around me? I stopped showering regularly because it required energy I didn't have. I stopped doing laundry because Richard's clothes were mixed in with mine, and seeing his shirts and ties felt like being stabbed repeatedly. I survived on saltine crackers and chamomile tea, the only foods that didn't make me nauseous with grief. The worst moments came in the evening when muscle memory would kick in, and I'd find myself brewing 2 cups of tea instead of 1, setting 2 placemats at the table before remembering there was only me now. I'd catch myself saving interesting stories from my day to tell Richard later, only to remember he would never be later again. I felt like I was fading away. I tell people now, when they ask about that time, not just grieving Richard's death, but actually ceasing to exist myself. Like I'd been only half a person for so long that without him, there wasn't enough left of me to continue living. I was wrong, but I didn't know that yet. Thomas Whitman's phone call came on a gray Thursday morning, exactly 3 weeks and 2 days after Richard's funeral. I was sitting on my living room couch in the same clothes I'd worn for the past 3 days, staring at a cup of cold tea that had been sitting untouched on my coffee table since the night before. "Mrs. Carter, I apologize for disturbing you during this difficult time," Thomas said in his careful lawyer voice. "But I need you to come to my office. Richard left some final instructions that require your immediate attention." "Can't we handle this over the phone?" I asked, not wanting to leave the safety of my house. The thought of getting dressed, driving downtown, and sitting in meetings about paperwork felt overwhelming. "I'm afraid not, Mrs. Carter. Richard was very specific that this particular matter be handled in person and only with you present. Would tomorrow morning at 10 work?" So there I was, 24 hours later, sitting across from Thomas in his mahogany-paneled office on LaSalle Street, feeling like I was floating outside my own body. The funeral arrangements had been handled, Richard's life insurance processed, his will read to the family. What could possibly be left? "Mrs. Carter," Thomas began, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he consulted a yellow legal pad. "Richard came to see me about 6 months before his death with some very unusual requests." 6 months. That timeline hit me like a physical blow. 6 months ago was when the mysterious phone calls started, when Richard began working late, when everything in our marriage started feeling different. Thomas reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a wooden box about the size of a jewelry case, made of what looked like cherry wood with brass hinges. It was completely unmarked, its surface smooth and innocent-looking. He placed it carefully on the desk between us, as if it contained something precious or dangerous. Richard left very specific instructions about this box, Thomas continued, watching my face carefully. He said that under no circumstances should it be opened by anyone other than you, and only after his other affairs were properly settled. I stared at the box, my heart beginning to pound. What's inside it? I don't know, Mrs. Carter. Richard sealed it himself and gave me explicit instructions not to examine its contents under any circumstances. My hands were trembling as I reached for the box. It was heavier than it looked, solid and substantial in my grip. The wood was warm, as if it had been sitting in sunlight, and the brass hinges moved smoothly when I tested them. "Are you ready, Mrs. Carter?" Thomas asked gently. I nodded, though I wasn't ready for anything. I lifted the lid slowly, almost afraid of what I might find inside. 3 items lay nestled in the red velvet lining: a small brass key attached to a leather keychain, a sealed white envelope with my name written across the front in Richard's familiar handwriting, and a photograph that made my blood run cold. It was a picture of Richard with a woman I'd never seen before. She was young, maybe 30 years old, with shoulder-length dark hair and a bright smile. Richard's arm was wrapped around her waist in a gesture of intimate familiarity, and they were both laughing at something outside the camera's view. They looked happy. They looked like a couple, but what made my stomach drop wasn't just seeing my husband with another woman. It was the timestamp in the corner of the photograph. September 15th, just 6 months ago, right around the time Richard started taking those mysterious phone calls. I picked up the envelope with Richard's name for me, my fingers barely steady enough to break the seal. I sat in Thomas Whitman's office, staring at Richard's letter for what felt like an eternity before finding the courage to unfold it. My hands were shaking so violently that the paper rustled like autumn leaves in a windstorm. When I finally opened, Richard's familiar handwriting, looked different somehow, more hurried, less careful than the love notes he used to leave me on our kitchen counter. The letter was dated just 2 weeks before his heart attack. "My dearest Elena," it began, and even those 3 words made my chest tighten with a mixture of love and dread. "By the time you read this, I will be gone, and you will have discovered what I was too much of a coward to tell you while I was alive. I know this revelation will devastate you, and I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, but I need you to understand the full truth about the man you married." My vision blurred with tears, but I forced myself to keep reading. "The safety deposit box key in this box will lead you to First National Bank on Michigan Avenue, box number 4947. Inside, you will find documents, letters, and evidence of a life I built separate from ours. For the past 3 years, I have been living a double existence, deceiving not only you, but another woman named Victoria Morrison, who believed she was in a relationship with a divorced man. Victoria Morrison. The name from that phone call I'd witnessed months ago suddenly clicked into place like a puzzle piece I'd been holding upside down. I told Victoria that my wife, you, suffered from early onset dementia and no longer recognized me. I told her that we lived separately, that our marriage existed only on paper for insurance purposes. Every lie I told her was another betrayal of you, Elena. Every moment I spent with her was time stolen from our life together. The letter continued for 2 more pages, detailing Richard's elaborate deceptions. The apartment he rented across town, the separate bank account he funded with money from our joint savings, the weekend getaways he disguised as business trips. Each revelation felt like a physical blow. But strangely, With each admission, something inside me began to shift. I want you to have all the evidence, Elena, because you deserve to make informed decisions about what comes next. You deserve to know exactly who you were married to, and you deserve the power to choose how this story ends. I was a coward who chose deception over honesty, convenience over courage, but I want you to have what I never gave you in life: complete control over the truth. The final paragraph nearly broke me. You were the best part of my life, Elena. Even when I was too selfish and too weak to act like it, you deserved a better husband than me. You deserved honesty, respect, and fidelity. You deserved to be someone's entire world, not just the acceptable public face of their secret life. I hope someday you can find it in your heart to forgive me. But more importantly, I hope you can find the strength to build a life that honors the remarkable woman you are. I set the letter down on Thomas's desk and looked up at him through my tears. But for the first time in weeks, maybe months, the tears weren't just from grief or confusion. There was something else mixed in, a strange, unexpected feeling of clarity. "Mrs. Carter," Thomas said gently, "are you all right? Do you need some water, or would you like to take a break?" "No," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "I need to go to that bank. I need to see everything." For the first time since Richard's death, I felt completely awake. I left Thomas Whitman's office that Thursday afternoon with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in months. The brass key felt warm in my palm as I walked the 6 blocks to First National Bank on Michigan Avenue, my steps steadier than they'd been since Richard's funeral. The March wind whipped through downtown Chicago, but for the first time in weeks, I barely noticed the cold. The bank manager, a soft-spoken woman named Patricia Chen, escorted me to the safety deposit box vault in the basement. "Box 447 has been paid through the end of this year," she explained as she inserted her master key alongside mine. "Your husband was very specific about the access protocols." Of course he was. Richard had planned every detail of this revelation with the same meticulous care he'd used to plan our family vacations and retirement investments. The metal box slid out of the wall with a soft scraping sound. Inside, I found Richard's secret life organized with terrifying precision. There were lease agreements for a 1-bedroom apartment at 1247 North State Street, just 15 minutes from our house. Bank statements showed monthly deposits of $3,000 into an account I'd never known existed. Credit card bills revealed charges at restaurants I'd never been to, hotels I'd never seen, jewelry stores where Richard had apparently purchased gifts for someone else. But it was the letters that truly broke my heart. Dozens of them written in Richard's handwriting addressed to my darling Victoria. I read 3 before I had to stop, my hands shaking as I discovered the depth of his emotional betrayal. These weren't just the words of a man having an affair. They were love letters from someone who had built an entire alternate identity. "I dream about the life we'll have together once I can finally leave this arrangement," he'd written to Victoria, just 4 months before his death. "Once Elena's condition worsens enough to require full-time care, we can be together openly. I know it's difficult being patient, but what we have is worth protecting." I photographed everything with my phone, every document, every letter, every receipt. I wasn't sure what I planned to do with the evidence, but something told me I would need it. My grief was transforming into something else entirely, a cold, calculating determination to understand exactly what my marriage had been. After 2 hours in that vault, I drove to 1247 North State Street. The building was a converted warehouse in River North, the kind of trendy development that attracted young professionals and wealthy divorces. I sat in my car across the street, staring up at the 3rd-floor windows, imagining Richard climbing those stairs to a life that didn't include me. That evening, I did something I hadn't done since Richard's death. I opened my laptop. While chamomile tea grew cold beside me, I researched everything. I found Victoria Morrison's LinkedIn profile, marketing specialist at Creative Solutions. Inc., 29 years old, graduated from Northwestern in 2016. She was beautiful in that effortless way that made my 62-year-old reflection feel ancient. I created a new email account under a false name and started gathering information. I found the restaurant where Richard had taken Victoria for what his credit card statement labeled as their 6-month anniversary dinner. I located the jewelry store where he'd purchased a diamond necklace that had never appeared around my neck. Most importantly, I hired David Chen, a private investigator recommended by Thomas Whitman. I needed to know everything. I told him during our phone consultation every detail of their relationship, every lie he told both of us, every person who knew about this double life. "Mrs. Carter," David said carefully, "are you sure you're prepared for what we might discover?" "I'm prepared for the truth," I replied. "All of it." David Chen's first report arrived in my email just 5 days after I hired him. What I discovered made my blood run cold, but it also filled me with something I hadn't felt in years: complete control over my own story. Victoria Morrison wasn't just Richard's mistress. She had been his former secretary at Midwest Mutual Insurance until 18 months ago. According to David's research, she left the company to pursue other opportunities. But the timeline coincided perfectly with when Richard's work emergencies became more frequent. The apartment lease showed Richard had signed it under the name Richard Michaels, using his middle name as a last name. He'd listed his marital status as divorced and his emergency contact as Victoria Morrison. The rent was $2,800 per month, paid directly from the secret account he'd been funding with money transferred from our joint savings. Money I'd assumed was going toward our retirement in Italy. But the most damaging evidence came from Richard's cell phone records, which David had somehow obtained through his professional connections. For 3 years, Richard had been in daily contact with Victoria. Text messages, phone calls, voicemails, sometimes 20 or 30 communications per day. On the very morning of his heart attack, while I was making his breakfast downstairs, Richard had sent Victoria a text message. "Can't wait to see you tonight. Tell me again about that house you found in Evanston." They had been house hunting together while married to me. David's investigation revealed that Richard had spun an elaborate web of lies to everyone around him. He told his golf buddies that he and I were having problems and might separate soon. He'd informed his brother Carol that I was becoming increasingly difficult to live with as I aged. He'd even consulted with a divorce attorney the previous summer, though he'd never filed any papers. Most shocking of all, Victoria had no idea about the extent of Richard's deception. When David approached her, posing as an insurance investigator following up on Richard's death, she broke down completely. He told me his wife Elena had early-onset Alzheimer's. Victoria had sobbed, according to David's detailed report. He said she didn't recognize him anymore, that they lived separately for her safety, and that their marriage was only maintained for insurance purposes and her medical care. Victoria revealed that Richard had promised to marry her as soon as Elena's condition required institutional care. He'd shown her brochures for memory care facilities, claiming he was researching the best options for my inevitable placement. The cruelest detail was that Richard had scheduled their first official date for the weekend after he died, a romantic getaway to a bed and breakfast in Door County, Wisconsin. Victoria had been sitting in her apartment, packed and ready to go, when she received the call about Richard's heart attack. Armed with this information, I made a decision that would have been impossible for the grieving widow I'd been just 2 weeks earlier. I scheduled a meeting with Victoria Morrison. "I'd like to meet for coffee," I wrote from my fake email account, signing as Sarah Williams, Richard's insurance representative. "There are some final details about Mr. Carter's policy that require clarification and some personal effects he wanted you to have." Victoria agreed immediately, suggesting we meet at Café Brower in Lincoln Park Zoo. Ironically, the same cafe where Richard had taken me for our first date 40 years earlier. As I sat in my kitchen, planning exactly what I would say to the woman who'd unknowingly helped destroy my marriage, I felt something I hadn't experienced since I was a young woman: the intoxicating power of holding all the cards. For the first time in our entire relationship, I knew more about Richard Carter than anyone else alive. The meeting with Victoria Morrison took place on a surprisingly warm Saturday morning in April at Café Brouwer. I arrived 30 minutes early, choosing a corner table with a clear view of the entrance, positioning myself like a chess player who'd already calculated every possible move. When Victoria walked through the cafe doors at exactly 10 a.m., I recognized her immediately from her LinkedIn photo. But seeing her in person hit me differently than I'd expected. She was even younger looking than 29, with an earnestness in her face that reminded me of myself at that age. She wore a simple black dress and carried a small bouquet of white roses. "Are you Sarah Williams?" she asked, approaching my table hesitantly. "Please sit down," I said, gesturing to the chair across from me. "But before we begin, I need to tell you something important. My name isn't Sarah Williams. I'm Elena Carter, Richard's widow." The color drained from Victoria's face so quickly I thought she might faint. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white, the bouquet trembling in her other hand. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I never knew. Richard told me you had Alzheimer's, that you didn't remember him anymore. He said you lived in a care facility and that your marriage was just legal paperwork to protect your medical benefits." "I know exactly what Richard told you," I replied calmly. "And I know that you believed him because he was very convincing when he wanted to be. I also know that you loved him and that he promised to marry you once my condition worsened." Victoria started crying then, not the dramatic sobbing of someone caught in wrongdoing, but the quiet, devastated tears of someone realizing they'd been used. "He showed me brochures for memory care facilities," she said through her tears. "He said he was researching the best places for when you needed full-time care." I felt sorry for him, carrying such a heavy burden alone. "Richard was never alone," I said, keeping my voice steady. "He was living a double life, Victoria. He had a wife who cooked his meals, managed his household, and supported his career for 37 years. And he had a young woman who believed his lies and gave him the excitement he thought he deserved." Victoria set the bouquet on the table between us. "These were for him," she said quietly, "for his grave. I couldn't bring myself to visit until now because I felt like I didn't have the right. I thought I was just his girlfriend, not important enough to mourn him properly. That's when something unexpected happened. Instead of anger, I felt an overwhelming sadness for both of us. Two women who'd been manipulated by the same man in different ways. "Victoria," I said gently, "Richard didn't have the right to promise you a future he was never going to deliver. You were 26 years old when this started. You deserved honesty about what you were getting into." "Did you love him?" she asked suddenly, looking directly into my eyes for the first time since sitting down. "I loved the man I thought he was," I replied, "just like you did." We sat in silence for several minutes, two women processing the wreckage of the same man's deceptions. Finally, Victoria spoke again. "What happens now? Are you going to expose everything, ruin his reputation?" I had been wondering the same thing for weeks, but sitting across from this young woman who'd been just as deceived as I had been, I realized that revenge wasn't what I wanted. "I'm going to tell my children the truth," I said, "and then I'm going to decide how I want to spend the rest of my life. As for Richard's reputation, he destroyed that himself." 3 days after my meeting with Victoria, David Chen called with information that would give me the final piece of Richard's puzzle and present me with the most difficult decision of this entire ordeal. "Mrs. Carter," David said, his voice unusually serious over the phone, "I've discovered something that changes everything. Richard wasn't just deceiving you and Victoria about his personal life. He was embezzling from Midwest Mutual Insurance to fund his double life." My blood went cold. "What do you mean, embezzling?" Over the past 3 years, Richard systematically diverted insurance claim payments into his secret account. Small amounts from multiple claims, $500 here, $200 there, but it adds up to nearly $180,000. the apartment rent, the gifts for Victoria, the restaurant bills, even that planned getaway to Door County, all paid for with stolen money. I sat down heavily at my kitchen table, the same table where Richard had eaten breakfast the morning of his heart attack, having no idea his crimes were about to be discovered. How did he avoid detection? He was smart about it, David explained. As a senior executive, he had approval authority on claim payments. He'd authorize legitimate claims, but then redirect portions to his personal account through a complex routing system. The company's annual audit isn't for another 6 months. He probably thought he had time to cover his tracks or disappear entirely. The implications hit me like a freight train. If Richard's embezzlement was discovered, it wouldn't just destroy his reputation. It would invalidate his life insurance policy, eliminate his pension benefits, and potentially make me liable for restitution. Marcus and Sarah could lose their inheritance entirely. David, what are my options here? Legally, you have 3 choices, he replied. 1, you can do nothing and hope the company never discovers the discrepancies. 2, you can expose everything and let the legal consequences fall where they may. Or 3, what? You use the money in Richard's secret account to quietly return what he stole, and this never comes to light. I spent the next 2 days wrestling with a moral dilemma that would have been unimaginable a month earlier. Richard had stolen money to fund his affair, but exposing him would punish our children for his crimes. Yet staying silent made me complicit in his theft. On Friday morning, I made my decision. I called Thomas Whitman and arranged a meeting with Midwest Mutual's president, Robert Hayes, whom Richard had mentioned countless times over dinner, but whom I'd never met. Mr. Hayes, I said, sitting in his corner office overlooking Lake Michigan. I'm here to discuss some irregularities my late husband Richard may have been involved in before his death. I presented him with a cashier's check for $180,000 from Richard's secret account, along with a detailed spreadsheet David Chen had prepared showing exactly which claims had been compromised. Mrs. Carter, Mr. Hayes said, clearly stunned. This is extraordinarily unusual. Why are you bringing this to my attention? Because my husband's personal failures don't excuse his professional crimes, I replied. But I also believe his mistakes shouldn't destroy his children's future or his legitimate policy benefits. Mr. Hayes studied the documents for several minutes. What you're proposing is essentially that we treat this as voluntary restitution rather than discovered embezzlement. I'm proposing that justice doesn't always require public humiliation, I said. Richard is dead. He can't be punished, but his family can be protected. His victims can be made whole, and the company can avoid the scandal of not detecting this. For 3 years. After a long pause, Mr. Hayes nodded. I think we can work with this approach, Mrs. Carter. Your husband's employment record and insurance benefits will remain intact. Walking out of that building, I realized I had done something Richard never could. I had chosen courage over self-interest. 2 weeks after my meeting with Robert Hayes at Midwest Mutual, I was in my kitchen preparing dinner for myself, something I'd finally started doing again when my doorbell rang. Through the front window, I could see Marcus standing on my porch, holding the hand of my 5-year-old granddaughter, Emma. I hadn't seen either of them since the week after Richard's funeral, when family obligations had brought everyone together. Marcus had been distant during those visits, clearly uncomfortable with grief and unsure how to help his suddenly single mother navigate widowhood. Mom, Marcus said when I opened the door, his voice carrying a weight I hadn't heard since he was a teenager. Emma wanted to see Grandma Elena, and I think we need to talk. Emma immediately wrapped her small arms around my legs, her face lighting up with the uncomplicated joy that only children possess. Grandma, I missed you so much. Daddy said you were very sad and needed space, but I wanted to give you hugs. I missed you too, sweetheart, I said, kneeling down to her level and feeling the first genuine smile I'd had in weeks cross my face. Would you like some cookies? I made chocolate chip ones yesterday. While Emma busied herself with cookies and milk in the kitchen, Marcus and I sat in the living room where I'd spent so many sleepless nights on the couch. The afternoon light streaming through the windows somehow made the space feel less haunted than it had in months. "Mom, I owe you an apology," Marcus began, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "After Dad died, I just shut down. I didn't know how to help you, so I convinced myself you needed space. But the truth is, I was scared. Scared of your grief, scared of my own grief, scared that if I let myself feel everything, I wouldn't be able to function." "Marcus, you don't need to apologize for—" "Yes, I do," he interrupted gently. "You lost your husband of 37 years, and instead of supporting you, I disappeared into my own life. Sarah and I talked, and we both realized we abandoned you when you needed us most." I felt tears forming in my eyes, but they weren't the devastated tears of the past months. These were different, complex emotions mixing grief with gratitude and relief. "There's something I need to tell you about your father," I said carefully. Knowing this conversation would change how Marcus viewed his childhood, his family, and his father's legacy forever. Marcus's face grew serious. "What do you mean?" Over the next hour, I told Marcus everything. I showed him Richard's letter, the photographs, the evidence of the apartment, and the secret bank account. I explained about Victoria, about the embezzlement, about the systematic deception that had characterized the final years of my marriage. Marcus listened in stunned silence, his face cycling through disbelief, anger, and heartbreak. When I finished, he sat quietly for several minutes, processing what I'd revealed. "Mom," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, "why are you telling me this now? Why didn't you just let us keep believing Dad was perfect?" "Because secrets are poison, Marcus," I replied. "They destroyed my marriage, even though I didn't know it at the time. I won't let them destroy our family relationships, too. You deserve to know who your father really was. Not the saint we talked about at his funeral, but the complicated, flawed man who made terrible choices." "But what if I didn't want to know?" Marcus asked, pain evident in his voice. "Then that would have been your choice to make," I said. "But I needed to give you the truth so you could decide for yourself." Marcus looked toward the kitchen where Emma's laughter could be heard. "What do we do now?" 6 months after that wooden box shattered my world. I'm sitting in my new apartment in downtown Evanston, watching the sunrise through the windows. I chose myself. The space is smaller than the house Richard and I shared on Maple Street, but every single item in it reflects a decision I made freely without considering what anyone else might think or want. The yellow bedroom walls are gone, replaced by soft white paint that catches the morning light beautifully. I kept Richard's wedding ring in a small jewelry box on my dresser, not as a shrine, but as a reminder of the complicated nature of love and memory. My own wedding ring sits beside it now, removed not in anger, but in honesty. I am no longer Richard Carter's wife. I am simply Elena. And for the first time in decades, that feels like enough. The house on Maple Street sold within 3 weeks of being listed. I couldn't live surrounded by the memories of a marriage that I now understood had been half fiction. Marcus and Sarah helped me pack, and we sorted through 37 years of accumulated history together. Some items went to charity, some went to my children, and some, like our wedding album and family photos, found new homes in my smaller space where they coexist peacefully with the truth. Victoria Morrison sent me a card after Richard's birthday. Would have passed in August. Inside, she'd written, "Thank you for showing me that being angry with a dead man is less important than being honest with ourselves. I'm in therapy now, learning to trust my instincts better." I realized that our brief meeting at the cafe had freed both of us from Richard's manipulations. My relationship with Marcus and Sarah has changed completely, but in ways I never expected. They call more often now, not out of duty, but out of genuine connection. We talk about real things, their struggles with marriage, their concerns about raising children, their own questions about trust and honesty in relationships. The perfect family facade we maintained while Richard was alive has been replaced by something messier, but infinitely more authentic. Emma, now 6, still asks about Grandpa Richard sometimes. Grandma Elena, she said during her last visit. Daddy says Grandpa made some mistakes, but that doesn't mean he didn't love us. Is that true? I knelt down to her level and looked into those clear, trusting eyes. It's very true, sweetheart. People can love you and still make choices that hurt you. That's why it's so important to always tell the truth, even when it's hard. Will you always tell me the truth, Grandma? Always, I promised her. And I meant it. The lessons from that wooden box have become the foundation of how I live now. I've started dating again, something I never thought I'd do at 63. When James Fletcher, a kind widower from my book club, asked me to dinner, I told him the entire story about Richard on our second date, not because I owed him my history, but because I refused to build any relationship on partial truths ever again. Most people might have kept that to themselves, James said after I finished telling him about the affair, the embezzlement, and the double life. Most people probably would, I agreed. But I've learned that secrets rot relationships from the inside out. I'd rather be alone and honest than coupled and deceiving myself. James smiled and reached across the table to squeeze my hand. Elena, I think your honesty might be the most attractive thing about you. That night, I understood something profound. Richard had been both the love of my life and the lie of my life, and both realities could coexist without destroying me. The wooden box hadn't just contained evidence of his deception. It had contained my liberation.